So back to our list of content, and the next thing I want to change is the way that we edit these notes. So as you'll recall, what we currently do is we click on the edit button and it opens an overlay with the edit form, and then we make whatever edit we want, hit the save button, and then after the save is complete it reloads this entire page. And although that's very fast, it could be a little more seamless. So I want to invoke a little more JavaScript action here, so that what we'll end up with is clicking the edit button will replace the content in each note with the form fields that are currently loaded in the overlay, and then when we hit the save button after a successful save, it will remove the form fields again and replace them with the updated content. To begin with, I want to take a look at our existing edit form, and I'm going to open it into a new tab rather than in its overlay so that I've got access to the full inspector here. So here it is, and if we just take a look at these form rows here, they sit inside a block body tag, and you can see that that encompasses both the single line text input and the multi-line text input, but the button is included in this form submit row, which is outside of the block body. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to be able to pluck the two text inputs and the button in one go from the template. And now those of you who are looking at this will probably notice that the block container does contain all of those form fields, but I don't want to insert an additional block container onto the other page because block container has specific styling, like the border and stuff on the box, so I don't want to grab that. What I actually want to do is I want to take my existing inputs and put them into another container that doesn't have any stylistic meaning. So I'll switch over to the template editor here, and I'm just going to create a div, and I'm going to give it, as I said, a class that has no meaning as far as styling is concerned. And because it's going to be something that is used by JavaScript, I'm going to prefix it with JS. So I'm just going to call it JS controls. And then I'm going to take the end of the div and stick it over there, and then I'm going to put the form submit row underneath there. I mean, ideally your submit row would be outside the block body, but I don't think it actually makes very much difference stylistically anyway. And as we're not going to be using this form as anything except a fallback in case the JavaScript based editor doesn't work, I'm not too worried about it. So now I've got this JS controls selector here. Let's refresh that page to get the updates. And now we should be able to see, if I inspect something in here, that JS controls contains all the stuff we want. The next step is going to be to get the items on this page to pull in the JS controls from this form. And to do that, I'm going to use a built-in XenForo JavaScript function called the inserter. And you'll find that in structure.js. In case you're interested, and you'll see that we have this function called inserter, and you'll see it used throughout the XenForo code in its inserter focus and inserter click guises, and essentially it just has a bunch of controls to allow you to load some content and then insert it into the page. And the particular version of the inserter I'm going to be using here is the option to replace. So you'll see here that we've got options for after and append and before and prepend and replace. So I'm going to be using replace to tell it to load some content and then replace one item with another item. So let's see if we can identify the items that we want to replace. We'll work on this one here. So let's inspect this. And we should see that we've got this block body and then a pad note header. We don't want to replace that. And then we've got the article class equals pad note article. And as you can see from the bits that are highlighted on the screen, that's exactly what we want to replace. So we're going to be targeting the pad note article. So let's see how we do that. We're going to come across to the index page, and here is the edit button. And right now we've got this overlay true syntax, and overlay true is actually something that XenForo's templater reads, and it will convert that into the appropriate activation for the overlay JavaScript, which actually looks like data XF.Click equals overlay. So we don't want that. We want to manually specify a different action for clicks. So data XF.Click equals, and we're going to be using inserter. And then we have to give it some arguments. Now if we pop back to structure.js, you can see that it's got these options that are currently initialized with null or true or whatever makes sense. But we need to pass arguments to that. And the way we do that is we use more data parameters on this particular button. So I wanted to pass in the data replace, which would equate to this option here. So the way I do that is I'll just say data replace, and then the value of this will become the value of that once it's read in by this particular function. So what do I want to replace? Well, I know that in here I've got an ID'd note, which gives me a unique identifier for the content on the page, and then I've got a class within the ID'd note of padNote article. So I'm going to tell it that I want to replace padNote, whatever note I'm on, padNote article, with the JS controls that's being loaded in from the thing that we're loading with this href. Let's just do it and we'll see how it works. So I want to replace padNote dash note.noteID dot padNote article. So that selects the article tag within here. So that's the thing we're going to be replacing. And what do we want to replace it with? Well, we say with .js controls. And this specifies the selector for the item within the content that's being loaded. So now that should be all we need. So let's refresh this so that we get the updated code. And what we should see now is when I click this edit button, this will fade out and scroll away, and the form fields that are contained within the JS controls are loaded in. And there they are. So we could do with a little bit of style tidying up. You can see that there's a padding around here that is not ideal. So let's go and deal with that. We'll just come into demo pad less, and we'll say that we want a specific case for, where is this actually? I think it's inside padNote main. So let's say that the JS controls within padNote main, because we're using less, not CSS here, has a margin of 0 at the top, because let's just inspect that and you can see that there's the JS controls, and you can see that it butts right up to the top of that horizontal rule there. But then we've got some spacing around the outside. So we'll have a 0 top margin, and then we'll have a bit of maths in here. It's XF padding medium, I believe. We want that in the negative form to make negative that amount of padding. I am going to suggest that you do this long-winded way of working with maths rather than just saying negative XF padding medium, because at some point in the future XenForo will start to use strict maths in less rather than allowing the rather looser form that we currently allow. But this will set a negative margin on that content there. So let's just try it out. And now we see that it butts right up to the edge of the page. So now what happens if we hit the save button? Well, here I am clicking the save button madly and nothing's happening. And the reason for that is because we've only brought in the controls. We haven't actually inserted them into a form. If we were to inspect this, in fact we've already got it, haven't we? Let's inspect that and see up the tree, we just end up with more and more divs going right up to the root of the page. Whereas in here, we're contained with a form that tells it what to do. So we're going to need to change around the template for our notes on here to actually be enclosed within a form. Thankfully, that's also fairly straightforward. So let's pop in here. And while we're here, I'm just going to make a couple of changes. I'm going to make this so that we actually use block for the form itself, which means that in the demo pad less, it's now going to be a child. Block containers are going to be a child of pad note, not the thing itself. And in here, I'm going to build the form. So we need an XF form, and I think I've got a template set up for that. Yes, I have. The link is demo/notes. Isn't it? No, it's not. It's notes/save. And which one do we want to save? We want to save this note using a root parameter. And then we've got Ajax is 1 and class equals block, but I also want to have class equals pad note. And then take that away from the block container. So now we can just whip that off of there, get rid of those, bump all of this in, and put the closing form tag there. So now we have a form tag that's also the block and identifies it as a pad note. Let's get rid of that one. And we'll move the ID up onto the form itself. And that should be all we need. Let's just have a quick check. What I'm expecting now is that when I click the edit button and bring the form fields in here, I should now be able to put in some edited text and hit save, and I'll get it saved from that point, but it will have done the redirect rather than the in-place save. Let's just check that again. Edit to, save the note, and yeah, that's brought it through. Okay, so next we need to do the inline save. Let's talk briefly about what we actually want to achieve here. The first thing is to analyze what currently happens, which of course is that we load up in our form fields through the inserter, and then we allow the content to be saved through the regular process. PHP does the saving to the entity, and then it returns a redirect. We can actually remind ourselves of that if we go to action save in here, and you can see that after the save process, the controller automatically returns a redirect with no possibility for anything else unless it was an error of some kind. So we need to have some custom JavaScript that's going to insert something into this form to instruct action save to do something other than the redirect. And what specifically? Well, we actually need a template to be returned that contains the updated content. So some custom JavaScript that will piggyback onto the save action of the form, insert something to tell the controller to do a different job, and then receive the template once it's been returned and insert it correctly into the page. Right now we don't actually have the ability to load a single note into a template because the only instance we have of the way a note appears is in this loop on the index page. So the first thing I want to do is to extract that and put it into another template so that I can call it using a macro. So I'm going to take out the whole of this form and just take it to the edge and cut it out, and then come into the template editor and add a template called demopad note, and then I'm going to paste in the content for the note there and save it out. Then I'll head back into here, and there it is. Let's edit it here, and now I'm going to make it into a macro. Now, if you haven't come across macros before, they are the ability for templates to call pieces of other templates with named parameters. It's a little bit like calling functions in something like PHP. The best way to display this is to just do it. So I'm going to define a macro here, and the name is going to be note, and then we have the arguments, and the arguments are all specified with an arg prefix. So arg note equals, and now I'm going to say exclamation mark there, which means that it is a required argument, and then I'll just surround the whole thing with that. And now from anywhere else in the code I can call this macro and give it an argument of a note entity, and it will display me a proper version of the note. Now one thing I do need to do here is I need to call that macro, because right now the macro is sort of encapsulated away from the main template. It won't actually display anything unless it's called, so let's call it. just say XF macro, name equals note, and we'll pass it the note that this template is going to get passed. So now we have a template that will return a single note for us. So let's go and use it in the index template. So just where the template came from, we'll just call the macro, but at the moment it doesn't have a macro called note in this template, so we just need to tell it where to get it, and it comes from the template called demo pad note, and then we use a double colon to tell it that this is the name of the template and that's the name of the item itself. And so now, just to follow this logic, we loop through notes, and on each iteration we have a note, and that note corresponds to the note that we pass into the macro, and this note, which gets assigned to arg note, becomes the note that lives in here. Now let's head over to the controller and set up some logic so that we can return this template instead of the redirect if certain conditions are met. And the first condition I want to check is that I only want to return the template if this is an AJAX request or an XHR XML HTTP request. So that can be checked like this. We'll just say if this request is XHR, but I also want to check that a new form field is passed through. And we're going to set that up when we build our custom JavaScript, but I'm going to have it insert a form field that's just called note edit. And if that field exists when the form is submitted, then I know that I want to return the template and not the redirect. So let's put that in. This request request exists, note edit. So I don't really care what the value of note edit is, which is why I'm not using filter, but I do want to check that it's there. And if that stuff is not true, then we'll return the standard redirect. So if we are not submitting through AJAX and we don't have the note edit parameter, then we'll return the redirect. But if we do, then we want to return this view demo pad note, and then the template we called demo pad note, and then let's have some view params. And what goes in our view params? Well, as you can see up here, we've got a note, so let's use that. An array with a note parameter that contains our note, whether that's come from the edit or from the from the creation or from the update. So that pretty much is all we need on the PHP front, and all that remains now is to go and plug in the JavaScript to make it do what we want to do. Let's head over to the JavaScript area of the XenForo source and create a new folder in there called demo, and within that we'll have a new JavaScript file called pad.js, and then I'm going to come into the page that's going to use it, demo pad index, and just as we pulled in the CSS, I want to pull in the XF.JS, and this time the source is going to be demo/pad.js, and that will roll that into the rest of the JavaScript in a sort of semi-magical way and allow you to use it on any page that uses this template, either as an include or an AJAX load or anything else like that. So always worth using the predefined XF CSS and XF.JS if you want your dynamic loading to work properly. Let's go and do something with pad.js then. The first thing we need is a standard wrapper that all XenForo JavaScript files have, which just isolates it against the rest of the environment. And now we need an event handler, or actually in fact it's an element handler in this case. What this is going to do is it's going to allow us to specify a particular class on the HTML element, and then at initialization time it will go and apply whatever JavaScript behaviors we describe here to that element. So let's have an element handler. and we're going to call it note edit. And then I'll have note edit as the identifier for the HTML. So let's go ahead and go and add that, and we'll kind of do this and the HTML in conjunction with each other. So into the demo pad note, because that's the thing that's going to be listening to it, it's going to be an additional behavior on the form. So let's just tidy this up a little, and we'll have data XF init equals note edit. So at initialization time, this form will have whatever behaviors are attached to the note edit identified JavaScript will be applied to this form. So that's good so far. So what are we actually going to have it do? Well, first of all, we need to have an event that listens for the Ajax submit event on the form and does something before the submission, namely to add the additional field. And then we also need something that listens to the Ajax submit response. So let's get on with that. Let's do the part where we add the new field first of all. So this, sorry, that's a bit of PHP. This dot target references the item to which the behavior is attached. On, we're using essentially jQuery syntax here, and the event is called Ajax submit before. How do I know that? Well, let's go and find it. Now, here's Ajax submit, and if we have a look down in the bits and pieces here, you can see that we've got an event here called Ajax submit before, and then we've got another one later on called Ajax submit something else, submit response. Ajax submit response. So it's response and before submit that we want to be listening to. So when the target fires Ajax submit before, then we're going to call a function that we're going to define within this class here called before submit, but we're going to use a little trick here to maintain the scope so that this maintains this rather than the scope of the element itself. So we're going to call XF.Proxy, pass it the scope, namely this, and then call the name of the method we want to use. And I'm going to call it before submit. So let's go and write before submit then. And I happen to know that it requires an event and a config parameter for that event. So then we're going to create a control through jQuery. Going to make it a hidden field. Now the name that we defined in the controller earlier that we're looking for is note edit. So let's grab hold of that and paste it into there. And then the value is largely immaterial because we just want to check that it exists. Close that off, and now we're ready to append that to the form. So let's get this target, which again is the form itself, and then within that we'll find our JS controls and append to that our new control. So just to talk through that again, at initialization time, this will set up a listener for before submit on the Ajax form submission, and then when that gets fired, we create a new hidden field called note edit, and then we append it to the JS controls container in our form. That's all fine. That's how we're going to identify the fact that we have this note edit thing that we requested later on. Now we need to check how to handle the response. So let's say this target on, and again it's Ajax submit, but this time response. Pass it off to the XF.Proxy, not to be confused with the image or link proxy. This has nothing to do with it. This is just about passing the scope of the current object. This and let's call it handle response. And what are we going to do in the handle response function? Well, we're going to be getting back a template, so it would make sense to make use of the functionality of the inserter. But in order to do that, we're going to have to sort of short circuit the inserter slightly, because the inserter is expecting to be instantiated from an HTML element and to be triggered by an event. And we're not going to be doing that, so we're going to have to do a little bit of trickery, but shouldn't be too tricky. So let's say handle response is a function, and again this has the event, and it takes the data that was returned by the response. And what should we do in there? Let's first of all go and grab that little bit of error checking that we found in, I can't remember where it is. Let's just type it out. Essentially, we want to say if data has errors, or if the data has an exception, then don't try to do anything else, just return and allow the standard error handling to continue. And then we're going to start to use the inserter. Now, the inserter has a function called onload that responds after it's done its work to actually get the data from the server. And we essentially want to start up our use of the inserter at that point. So I'm going to go in here and create an inserter at initialization time. And I'm going to say this inserter is a new XF.Inserter with this target as its control, and grab hold of this options. Now, we don't have any options yet, but the options that we need to pass it are the replace parameter, which tells us which thing we're going to replace with which other thing, and also we need to trick it into thinking that it does actually have a hyperlink that it's going to load its content from. But because we're not going to be calling it until after it's used that, that'll just get thrown away. So we're going to say that href is true. This is just to trick the initialization system of the inserter. Let's take a quick look at that, because if we're in here and if there's no href, then the target must have an href and it'll return false and bug out at that point. So we're going to trick it with that, and then we need to set up the replacement. But this time, because we don't know what we're working with at this point, we're just in sort of a function prototype here. We don't know what the actual data is going to be. I'm just going to set that to null so that it's initialized, and we'll pass that through options. So at this point, we now have some error checking here, and then this inserter onload. We'll call the onload function directly. Normally that would get called by an event and pass through the data. So we're just going to pass the data manually to onload and let it do its thing. So this, I think, is all we need for the JavaScript. And all that remains is to go back to the template and set up this replace bit. So let's head back over to the note, and under here we'll have a data replace equals. And now remember, we want to replace one thing with another thing, and the easiest way to replace a thing with another thing is to use its unique ID. So that's the ID here. But I don't want to have to type pad note ID stuff all the time, so let's just assign that to a variable up here. So XF set var equals ID, and value equals pad note dash note.note ID. That's all we need there. And now I can just change that to be ID, and the data replaced will be hash ID, because it's a JavaScript, a jQuery selector with with ID. Moment of truth then, let's go and see if it actually works. We'll refresh this page to bring in all the new code and then get rid of that inspector. Let's hit edit on there and get rid of some of this stuff. Change that to be a little more recognizable, and then what we're expecting to happen now is that when we hit save, the PHP will do its job, but it'll recognize that we've got the new parameter, the note edit hidden field in there, and as a result it will not redirect, it will send us back a template, and that template will then be intercepted by our JavaScript and will replace the content here. So let's check it. Magic.